Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are in section 12, titled Elements, and we are on subsection 51, and also I will just say, as I have in the others, that we are also following the paragraph numbers in this particular edition, and that will help you if you want to follow along or find where I am at some other point, exactly where I am. So it's paragraph 213, subsection 51. And with that, I'll get started. 213. In every pursuit, men without natural aptitude succeed by obstinate study of technique, but in poetry, he who lacks native ability cannot succeed by technique. 214. This axiom shows that, since poetry founded Gentile humanity, from which alone the arts were to spring, the first poets were such by nature. 52. Children excel in imitation. We observe them generally amuse themselves by imitating what they are able to understand. 216. This axiom shows that the world in its infancy was composed of poetic nations, for poetry is nothing but imitation. 217. This axiom will explain the fact that all the arts of things necessary, useful, convenient, and even a large part of those of human pleasure, were invented in the poetic centuries before the philosophers came. For the arts are nothing but imitation of nature, poems in a certain way made of things. 53. 218. Men at first feel without observing. Then they observe with a troubled and agitated spirit. Finally, they reflect with a clear mind. 219. This axiom is the principle of the poetic sentences, which are formed with senses of passions and affections, in contrast with philosophic sentences, which are formed by reflection and reasoning. The more the latter rise toward universals, the closer they approach the truth. The more the former take hold of particulars, the more certain they become. 54. 220. Whatever appertains to men but is doubtful or obscure, they naturally interpret according to their own natures and the passions and habits springing from them. 221. This axiom is a great canon of our mythology. According to it, the fables, originating among the first savage and crude men, were very severe, as befitted the founding of nations emerging from a state of fierce bestial freedom. Then, with the long passage of years and change of customs, they were impropriated, altered, and obscured in the dissolute and corrupt times even before Homer. Because religion was important to the men of Greece, and they feared to have the gods opposed to their desires as they were to their customs, they attributed their customs to the gods, and gave improper, ugly, and obscene meanings to the fables. 55. 222. That is a golden passage of Eusebius, from his account of the wisdom of the Egyptians as exalted above that of all other Gentiles, in which he says, "The first theology of the Egyptians was simply a history interspersed with fables, to which later generations, growing ashamed of them, gradually attached mystical interpretations. That is what was done, for instance, by Manethos, or Manetho, a high priest of the Egyptians, when he translated all Egyptian history into a sublime natural theology, as has been said above in section 46. 223. These two axioms are two great proofs of our historic mythology, and they are at the same time two great whirlwinds to confound any notion of the matchless wisdom of the ancients, and the two great foundations of the truth of the Christian religion, whose sacred history narrates nothing to be ashamed of. 56. 224. The first authors among the Easterners, Egyptians, Greeks, and Latins, and in the second barbarism, the first writers in modern languages of Europe, were poets. 57. 225. Mutes make themselves understood by gestures or objects that have natural relations with the ideas they wish to signify. 226. This axiom is the principle of the hieroglyphs by which all nations spoke in the time of their first barbarism. 227. It is also the principle of the natural speech which Plato, in the Credulus, and after him Iamblichus, on the mysteries of the Egyptians, guessed to have been spoken in the world at one time. Their view was shared by the Stoics and by Origen in Against Celsus. But since it was but a guess, it was opposed by Aristotle in his On Interpretation, and by Galen in his Doctrines of Hippocrates and Plato. The dispute is discussed by Publius Nigidius in Aulus Gellius. This natural speech must have been succeeded by the poetic discourse of images, similes, comparisons, and natural properties. 58. 228. Mutes utter formless sounds by singing, and stammerers by singing teach their tongues to pronounce. 59. 229. Men vent great passions by breaking into song, as we observe in the most grief-stricken and most joyful. 230. These two axioms, supposing that the founders of the Gentile nations had wandered about in the wild state of dumb beasts, and that, being therefore sluggish, they were inexpressive save under the impulse of violent passions, lead to the conjecture that their first languages must have been formed in singing. 60. 231. Languages must have begun with monosyllables, for even in the present abundance of articulated, i.e. polysyllabic words into which children are now born, they begin with monosyllables, in spite of the fact that in them the fibers of the organ necessary to articulate speech are very flexible. 61. 232. Heroic verse is the oldest of all, and spondaic the slowest, and farther on we shall see that heroic verse was originally spondaic. 62. 233. Iambic verse is the closest to prose, and the iamb is a quote-unquote swift foot, as Horace puts it. 234. These last two axioms lead us to conjecture that ideas and language developed at equal pace. 235. All these axioms, from the 47th on, together with those previously set forth as principles for all the rest, cover the divisions of poetic theory, namely fable, or plot, custom, or character, and its appropriateness, sentence, or thought, style, or diction, and its clarity, allegory, song, and finally, verse. The last 7 axioms establish the fact that among all nations, speech in verse preceded speech in prose. 63. 236. The human mind is naturally inclined by the senses to see itself externally in the body, and only with great difficulty does it come to attend to itself by means of reflection. 237. This axiom gives us the universal principle of etymology in all languages. Words are carried over from bodies, and from the properties of bodies to express the things of the mind and spirit. 64. 238. The order of ideas must follow the order of things. 65. 239. This was the order of human things. First, the forests, after that the huts, thence the villages, next the cities, and finally the academies. 240. This axiom is a great principle of etymology, for this sequence of human things sets the pattern for the histories of words in the various native languages. Thus we observe in the Latin language that almost the whole corpus of its words had Sylvan or rustic origins. For example, lex. First, it must have meant collection of acorns. Thence we believe is derived ilx, as it were illex, quote-unquote, the oak, as certainly aquilex is the collector of waters. For the oak produces the acorns by which the swine are drawn together. Lex was next a collection of vegetables, from which the latter were called legumina. Later on, at a time when vulgar letters had not yet been invented for writing down the laws, lex, by a necessity of civil nature, must have meant a collection of citizens, or the public parliament, so that the presence of the people was the law that solemnized the wills that were made collatus comitis, in the presence of the assembled comitia. Finally, collecting letters and making as it were a sheaf of them in each word was called legere, quote-unquote, reading. 66. 241. Men first feel necessity, then look for utility, next attend to comfort, still later amuse themselves with pleasure, thence grow dissolute in luxury, and finally go mad and waste their substance. 67. 242. The nature of peoples is first crude, then severe, then benign, then delicate, finally dissolute. 68. 243. In the human race first appear the huge and grotesque, like the Cyclops, then the proud and magnanimous, like Achilles, then the valorous and just, like Aristides and Scipio Africanus. Nearer to us, imposing figures with great semblances of virtue accompanied by great vices, who among the vulgar win a name for true glory, like Alexander and Caesar. Still later, the melancholy and reflective, like Tiberius. Finally, the dissolute and shameless madmen, like Caligula, Nero, and Domitian. 244. This axiom shows that the first sort were necessary in order to make one man obey another in the family state, and prepare him to be law-abiding in the city-state that was to come. The second sort, who naturally did not yield to their peers, were necessary to establish the aristocratic commonwealths on the basis of the families. The third sort to open the way for popular liberty. The fourth to bring in the monarchies. The fifth to establish them. The sixth to overthrow them. 245. This, with the preceding axioms, gives a part of the principles of the ideal eternal history traversed in time by every nation in its rise, development, maturity, decline, and fall. 69. 246. Governments must conform to the nature of the men governed. 247. This axiom shows that in the nature of human civil things, the public school of princes is the morality of the peoples. 70. 248. Let that be granted which is not repugnant to nature, and which we shall later find to be true, in fact, that from the nefarious state of the outlaw world, some few of the sturdiest first withdrew and established families, with whom and by whom they brought the fields under cultivation. And a long while later, the many others also withdrew and took refuge on the lands cultivated by these fathers. 71. 249. Native customs, and above all that of natural liberty, do not change all at once, but by degrees and over a long period of time. 72. 250. Since all nations began with the cult of some divinity, and the family state of the fathers must have been the sages and auspicial divinity, the priests who sacrificed to make the auspices or to make sure of their meaning, and the kings who brought the divine laws to their families. 73. 251. It is a vulgar tradition that the first to govern the world were kings. 74. 252. It is another vulgar tradition that those were created the first kings who were the worthiest. 75. 253. It is yet another vulgar tradition that the first kings were sages, wherefore Plato expressed the vain wish for those ancient times in which philosophers reigned or kings were philosophers. 254. All these axioms show that in the persons of the first fathers there were united wisdom, priesthood, and kingship, and the kingship and priesthood depended on the wisdom, not indeed the esoteric wisdom of the philosophers, but the vulgar wisdom of lawgivers. And therefore, thenceforward, in all nations the priests wore crowns. 76. 255. It is a vulgar tradition that the first form of government in the world was the monarchical. 77. 256. But the 67th axiom, with the others following, and in particular with the corollary of the 69th, show us that in the family state the fathers must have exercised a monarchical power, subject only to God, over both the persons and the property of their children, and to a much greater extent over those of the family, who had taken refuge on their lands. So they were the first monarchs of the world, of whom sacred history must be understood to speak when it calls them patriarchs or father-princes. This monarchical right was preserved to them for the entire period of the Roman Republic by the law of the 12 Tables. Quote, "The family father shall have power of life and death over his children," from which it follows that whatever the son acquires, he acquires for his father. 78. 257. The families cannot have taken their name, in keeping with their origin, from anything but these family of the fathers in the then state of nature. 79. 258. The first socii, who are properly companions associated for mutual advantage, cannot be imagined or understood to have existed in the world previous to these fugitives who sought to save their lives by taking refuge with the aforesaid first fathers, and who, having been received for their lives, were obliged to sustain them by cultivating the fields of the fathers. 259. These were the true socii of the heroes. Later they were the plebeians of the heroic cities, and finally the provincials of sovereign peoples. 80. 260. Men come naturally to the feudal system wherever they see a possibility of retaining in it or gaining from it a good and great share of utility, for such are the benefici, which may be hoped for in civil life. 81. 261. It is characteristic of the strong not to relinquish through laziness what they have acquired by courage. Rather do they yield, from necessity or for utility, as little as they can, and bit by bit. 262. From these two axioms spring the perennial sources of fiefs, which are called with Roman elegance benefices, beneficia. 82. 263. In all ancient nations we find everywhere clients and clientels, which are best understood as vassals and fiefs. Nor can learned writers on feudal law find apt Latin terms for the latter than clientes and clientele. 264. These last three axioms, with the preceding 12, beginning with the 70th, reveal to us the principles of the commonwealths born of a great necessity, which we shall later determine imposed upon the family fathers by the family, a necessity such that the commonwealths naturally took the aristocratic form. For the fathers united themselves in order to resist the famuli who had rebelled against them, and, once thus united, to satisfy these famuli and reduce them to obedience, they conceded to them a sort of rustic fiefs. The fathers in turn found their own sovereign family powers, which can only be understood on the analogy of noble fiefs, subjected to the sovereign civil authority of the ruling orders, in which they were now united. The chiefs of the orders were called kings. It was their function, as the most courageous, to lead the fathers in times of revolt among the family. If such an origin of cities were offered as a hypothesis, which later we find to be the fact, it would command acceptance by its naturalness and simplicity, and for the infinite number of civil effects which depend upon it as their proper cause. In no other way can we understand how civil power emerged from the family power, and the public patrimony from private patrimonies, or how the commonwealths had their elements prepared in the form of an order of a few to command a multitude of plebeians to obey them. These are the two parts which make up the subject matter of politics. It will later be shown that civil states could not have thus been formed from families containing children only, and not family. 83. 265. This law concerning the fields is established as the first agrarian law of the world, and it would be hard to imagine or conceive one more restricted in nature. 266. This agrarian law distinguished the three types of ownership, or domain, which can obtain in civil nature, attached to three classes of persons: the bonitary, to the plebeians; the quiritarii, maintained by arms and consequently noble to the fathers; and the eminent, to the order itself, which is the signory or sovereign power in aristocratic commonwealths. 84. 267. There is a golden passage in Aristotle's Politics, where, in his classification of commonwealths, he includes the heroic kingdoms in which the kings administered the laws at home, conducted wars abroad, and were heads of the state religion. 268. This axiom fits exactly the two heroic kingdoms of Theseus and Romulus, as we may see of the former in Plutarch's Life of him, and of the latter in Roman history. Supplementing Greek history with Roman, where Tullus Hostilius administers the law in the accusation against Horatius. And the Roman kings were kings also of sacred things, under the name of reges sacrorum, so that when the kings were driven from Rome, for the sake of certainty in the divine ceremonies, an officer was created to be called rex sacrorum, who was the head of the fetiales, or heralds. 85. 269. There is another golden passage in the Politics where Aristotle states that the ancient commonwealths had no laws to punish private offenses or to right private wrongs, and he says that such are the mores of barbarous peoples, for people are in their origins barbarous precisely because they are not yet tamed by laws. 270. This axiom shows the necessity of duels and reprisals in barbarous times, because in such times judicial laws are lacking. 86. 271. Golden, too, is that passage in the Politics where Aristotle says that in the ancient commonwealths the nobles swore to be eternal enemies of the plebs. 272. This axiom explains the cause of the haughty, avaricious, and cruel practices of the nobles towards the plebeians, which we see clearly portrayed in Roman history. For, within the bounds of what has hitherto been mistaken for popular liberty, for a long time they compelled the plebeians, at the latter's expense, to serve them in war, and drown them in a sea of usury. Then, as the wretched plebeians could not meet their claims, they confined them for life in private prisons, to make them pay off their debts by work and toil, and tyrannically beat them with rods on the bare shoulders, as if they were the most abject slaves. 87. 273. The aristocratic commonwealths are most cautious about going to war, lest they make warriors of the multitude of plebeians. 274. This axiom is the principle of the justice of the Roman arms up to the Punic Wars. 88. 275. The aristocratic commonwealths keep the wealth within the order of the nobility, for wealth adds to the power of this order. 276. This axiom is the principle of Roman clemency and victory, for they deprived the vanquished only of their arms, and left them in monetary ownership of everything else they had, subject to a tolerable tribute. Here, too, is the reason why the Roman fathers constantly resisted the agrarian laws of the Gracchi, because they did not wish to enrich the plebs. 89. 277. Honor is the noblest stimulus to military valor. 90. 278. Peoples are likely to conduct themselves heroically in war if in peace they compete among themselves for honors, some to retain them, others to win the merit of attaining them. 279. This axiom is a principle of Roman heroism from the time of the expulsion of the tyrants down to the Punic Wars. Within this period, the nobles naturally dedicated themselves to such a safeguarding of their country as kept all civil honors safe within their own order, and the plebs undertook the most noteworthy enterprises to show that they were worthy of the honors held by the nobles. 91. 280. The contests waged by the orders in the cities for equality of rights are the most powerful means of making the commonwealths great. 281. This is another principle of Roman heroism implemented by three public virtues: the magnanimity of the plebs in wanting to share the civil rights and laws of the fathers, the strength of the fathers in keeping them within their own order, and the wisdom of the jurisconsults in interpreting them and extending their utility, little by little, as new cases demanded adjudication. These are the three proper reasons for the distinction which Roman law attained in the world. 282. All these axioms, beginning with the 84th, set ancient Roman history forth in its proper aspect. The following three serve in part the same purpose. 92. 283. The weak want laws. The powerful withhold them. The ambitious, in order to win a following, advocate them. Princes, in order to equalize the strong with the weak, protect them. 284. This axiom, by its first and second clauses, is the torch of the heroic contest in the aristocratic commonwealths, in which the nobles want to keep the laws a secret monopoly of their order, so that they may depend on their will, and that they may administer them with a royal hand. These are the three causes adduced by Pomponius, the jurisconsult, where he relates that the Roman people desire the law of the 12 tables, complaining against the burdensomeness of secret, uncertain law and regal power. And it is the cause of the reluctance of the fathers to give these tables to the people, insisting that, quote, the customs of the fathers must be preserved, quote, and, quote, the laws must not be published, quote, as Dionysius of Halicarnassus states. He was better informed on Roman matters than Livy, for he wrote of them under the guidance of Marcus Terentius Varro, who was acclaimed the most learned of the Romans. On this particular matter he is diametrically opposed to Livy, who in his account of it says that the nobles, to use his words, quote, did not spurn the petitions of the plebs, quote. Because of this and other greater contradictions observed in our principles of universal law, there being such opposition between the first authors who wrote of this fable almost 500 years afterwards, it will be better not to believe either of the two. The more so, since in the same period it was believed neither by Varro himself, who in his great work on things divine and human, Antiquitates, gave purely Latin origins to all the institutions divine and human of the Romans, nor by Cicero, who makes the orator Marcus, i.e. Lucius Licinius, Crassus, say in the presence of Quintus Mucius Scaevola, the prince of the jurisconsults of his day, that the wisdom of the decimivers surpassed by a great deal that of Draco and Solon, who gave laws to the Athenians, and that of Lycurgus, who gave them to the Spartans, which is as much as to say that the laws of the 12 tables did not come to Rome from Athens or Sparta. Here we believe we are getting at the truth. In Cicero's day, the fable was too generally accepted among scholars, born as it was of the conceit of the learned in giving wisest origins to the wisdom they profess. This is the point of the words spoken by Crassus himself. Quote, "Though all of you grumble, I shall say what I think." End quote. Cicero's reason, therefore, for having Quintus Mucius present on that first day only was to remove any objection to his having an orator speak of the history of Roman law, the field of knowledge proper to the jurisconsults. These were the two distinct professions at that time. For if Crassus had said anything false on the subject, Mucius would certainly have reproved him for it, as according to Pomponius, he reproved Servius Sulpicius, who was present at this same discussion, saying to him that it was a disgrace for a nobleman not to know the law which was his profession. 285. But, more than Cicero and Varro, Polybius gives us an unanswerable reason for not believing either Dionysius or Livy, and Polybius without doubt knew more of politics than these two, and lived some 200 years nearer the age of the decimvirs than they did. He sets himself in the 6th book and the 4th and many following sections in the edition of Jacob Gronoff to examine carefully the constitutions of the most famous free commonwealths of his time, and he observes that the Roman constitution is quite different from that of Athens or Sparta. He finds it to differ from that of Athens even more than that from Sparta, though those who compare Attic with Roman law will have it that it was from Athens rather than from Sparta that the laws came to order of the popular liberty already founded by Brutus. But Polybius observes, on the other hand, a great similarity between the Roman and the Carthaginian constitutions. Yet no one has dreamed that the freedom of the latter was ordered by the laws of Greece. Indeed, so far is this from being true, that there was a law in Carthage expressly forbidding the Carthaginians to learn Greek. And how is it that such a learned writer on commonwealths does not investigate the reason of this difference, and does not raise on this point the very natural and obvious question? How can the Roman and Athenian commonwealths be different and yet ordered by the same laws, and the Roman and Carthaginian commonwealths be so similar but ordered by different laws? To absolve him of so flagrant an oversight, we are compelled to say that in the time of Polybius there had not yet been born at Rome this fable that the Greek laws had been brought there from Athens to order free popular government. 286. This same axiom, by its third clause, opens the way for the ambitious in the popular commonwealths to make themselves monarchs, by seconding a natural desire of the plebs, who, not understanding universals, want a law for every particular case. Thus Sulla, the head of the party of the nobles, when he had defeated Marius, the head of the party of the plebs, and was recognizing the popular state with an aristocratic government, remedied the multitude of laws by the Questiones Perpetuae, a permanent tribunal for criminal investigation. 287. And this same axiom, by its last clause, is the hidden reason why, beginning with Augustus, the Roman emperors made innumerable laws for private cases, and why the sovereigns and powers all over Europe received into their kingdoms and free commonwealths the corpus of Roman civil law and that of canon law. 93. 288. Since the door of honors in the popular commonwealths is wide open by law to the greedy multitude which is in command, in times of peace nothing remains but to struggle for power, not by law but by arms, and use the power to make laws for one's own enrichment. Such were the agrarian laws of the Gracchi at Rome. The result is civil wars at home, and unjust wars abroad at the same time. 289. In this axiom, Roman heroism is confirmed by the contrast for the entire period before the Gracchi. 94. 290. Natural liberty is fiercer in proportion as property attaches more closely to the persons of its owners, and civil servitude is clapped on with goods of fortune not essential to life. 291. The first part of this axiom is another principle of the natural heroism of the first peoples. The second part is the natural principle of monarchies. 95. 292. At first, men desire to be free of subjection and attain equality. Witness the plebs in the aristocratic commonwealths, which finally turn popular. Then they attempt to surpass their equals. Witness the plebs in the popular commonwealths later corrupted into commonwealths of the powerful. Finally, they wish to put themselves above the laws. Witness the anarchies or unlimited popular commonwealths, than which there is no greater tyranny, for in them there are as many tyrants as there are bold and dissolute men in the cities. At this juncture, the plebs, warned by the ills they suffer, and casting about for a remedy, seek shelter under monarchies. This is the natural royal law, by which Tacitus legitimizes the Roman monarchy under Augustus, quote, who, when the world was wearied by civil strife, subjected it to empire under the title of prince. 96. 293. When the first cities were established on the basis of the families, the nobles, by reason of their native lawless liberty, were opposed to checks and burdens. Witness the aristocratic commonwealths in which the nobles are lords. Later they are forced by the plebs, greatly increased in numbers and trained in war, to submit to laws and burdens equally with their plebeians. Witness the nobles in the popular commonwealths. Finally, in order to preserve their comfortable existence, they are naturally inclined to accept the supremacy of one ruler. Witness the nobles under the monarchies. 294. These two axioms, with the others preceding from the 66 on, are the principles of the ideal eternal history above referred to. 97. 295. Let it be granted, as a postulate not repugnant to reason, that after the flood men lived first on the mountains, somewhat later came down to the plains, and finally, after long ages, dare to approach the shores of the sea. 98. 296. In Strabo, there is a golden passage of Plato saying that after the local Ogygian and Deucalonian floods, men dwelt in caves in the mountains, and he identifies these first men with the Cyclopes, in whom elsewhere he recognizes the first family fathers of the world. Later they dwelt on the mountainsides, and he sees them represented by Dardanus, the builder of Pergamum, which later became the citadel of Troy. Finally, they came down to the plains. This he sees represented by Ilus, by whom Troy was moved onto the plain near the sea, and from whom it took the name of Ilium. 99. 297. It is also an ancient tradition that Tyre was founded first inland and later was moved onto the coast of the Phoenician Sea, as it is certain history that it was transported from the shore onto a close-lying island, from which Alexander the Great reattached it to the mainland by a causeway. 298. These two axioms in the preceding postulate shows us that the inland nations were founded first, and later the maritime. And they give us a great argument to prove the antiquity of the Hebrew people, which was founded by Noah in Mesopotamia, the country farthest inland of the first habitable world. So it must have been the most ancient of all nations. And this is confirmed by the fact that the first monarchy was founded there, that of the Assyrians over the Chaldean people, from whom came the first wise men of the world, their prince being Zoroaster. 100. 299. Only by extreme necessities of life are men led to abandon their own lands, which are naturally dear to those native to them. Nor do they leave them temporarily, except from greed to get rich by trade, or from anxiety to keep what they have acquired. 300. This axiom is the principle of the transmigrations of peoples. It is an induction from the heroic maritime colonies, the inundations of the barbarians, of which alone Wolfgang Latius wrote, the latest known Roman colonies, and the colonies of Europeans in the Indies. 301. And this same axiom shows us that the lost races of the three sons of Noah must be supposed to have gone off into the bestial wandering, fleeing from beasts, of which the great forest of the earth must have held an unhappy abundance, pursuing the shy and indocile women, for in such a savage state they must have been extremely indocile and shy, and then later seeking pasture land and water, in order to account for their being scattered over the whole earth, by the time when the heavens first thundered after the flood. It was thus that every Gentile nation began with its own Jove. For if these lost races had persisted in humanity as the people of God did, they would likewise have remained in Asia. For both because of the vastness of that great part of the world, and because of the paucity of men in those days, there were no compelling reason for their abandoning it, since it is not a natural custom to abandon one's native land through caprice. 101. 302. The Phoenicians were the first navigators of the ancient world. 102. 303. Nations in their barbarous condition are impenetrable. They must either be broken into from the outside by war or voluntarily opened to strangers for the advantages of trade. Thus Psammaticus opened Egypt to the Ionian and Carian Greeks, whose renown for maritime traffic must have been second to that of the Phoenicians. So great was their wealth that the temple of Samian Juno was founded in Ionia, and the mausoleum of Artemisia was built in Caria. And these were two of the seven wonders of the world. The glory of this trade was inherited by the Rhodians. In the mouth of their port they erected the great Colossus of the Sun, which was also counted among the above-mentioned wonders. So too the Chinese, with a view to the advantages of trade, have recently opened their country to us Europeans. 304. These three axioms give us the principle of a new etymologicon for words of certainly foreign origin, different from that of the above-mentioned, for native words. It can also give us the history of nations carried one after another into foreign lands by colonization. Thus, Naples was first called Cyrena, Siren, a Syriac word which is evidence that the Syrians, that is, the Phoenicians, have been the first to establish a colony there for commercial purposes. Later it was called Parthenope in Heroic Greek, and finally Neapolis in Vulgar Greek, names which prove that the Greeks had afterwards settled there to establish trading posts. From this succession there was sure to emerge a mixed language of Phoenician and Greek, in which it is said that the Emperor Tiberius took greater pleasure than in pure Greek. Thus also on the Gulf of Tarentum there was a Syrian colony called Cyrrhus, whose inhabitants were called Syrites. It was later called by the Greeks Polion, whence the appellation Polius was given to Minerva, who had a temple there. 305. This axiom, moreover, gives a scientific foundation to the thesis of Giambattista, that the Etruscan language is of Syriac origin. Such a language could have come only from the most ancient Phoenicians, who, by the axiom above laid down, were the first navigators of the ancient world. For later this glory belonged to the Carian and Ionian Greeks, and finally to the Rhodians. 103. 306. The postulate must needs be granted that on the shore of Latium some Greek colony had been set up, which after conquest and destruction by the Romans remained buried in the darkness of antiquity. 307. If this is not granted, anyone who reflects systematically upon antiquities must have been baffled by Roman history when it speaks of Hercules and Evander, Arcadians and Phrygians, within the boundaries of Latium, and of Servius Tullius as a Greek, Tarquinius Priscus as the son of Demaratus, the Corinthian, and Aeneas as the founder of the Roman people. Tacitus, in Annals, certainly speaks of the resemblance between Roman and Greek letters. Yet at the time of Servius Tullius, in the opinion of Livy, the Romans never even heard of the famous name of Pythagoras, who was teaching in his most celebrated school at Croton, and they did not make the acquaintance of the Greeks in Italy until the occasion of the war with Tarentum, which led to the later war with Pyrrhus and the Greeks across the sea. 104. 308. The remark of Dion Cassius, i.e. Chrysostom, is worthy of consideration, that custom is like a king, and law like a tyrant, which we must understand as referring to reasonable custom, and to law not animated by natural reason. 309. This axiom decides by implication the great dispute whether law resides in nature or in the opinion of men, which comes to the same thing as that propounded in the corollary of the 8th axiom, quote, whether man is naturally sociable, end quote. In the first place, the natural law of nations was ordained by custom, which Dion says commands us by pleasure like a king, and not by law, which Dion says commands us by force like a tyrant. For it began in human customs springing from the common nature of all nations, which is the proper subject of our science, and it preserves human society. Moreover, there is nothing more natural, for there is nothing more pleasant, than observing natural customs. For all these reasons, human nature, in which such customs have had their origin, is perforce sociable. 310. This axiom, with the 8th and its corollary, shows that man is unjust not by nature in the absolute sense, but by nature fallen and weak. Consequently, it demonstrates the first principle of the Christian religion, which is Adam before the fall, in ideal perfection in which he must have been created by God, and therefore it demonstrates the Catholic principles of grace, that it operates in the man who has privation and not negation of good works, and thus who has an inefficacious power for them, and that grace is efficacious therefore to supply this lack, that for that reason it cannot exist without the principle of free will, which God naturally aids by his providence, as has been said above in the second corollary of the same 8th axiom, with regard to which the Christian religion is in accord with all others. This is what Grotius, Selden, and Pufendorf should have founded their systems upon before everything else, in agreement with the Roman jurisconsuls, who define the natural law of nations as having been ordained by divine providence. 105. 311. The natural law of nations is coeval, with the customs of the nations conforming one with another in virtue of a common human sense, without any reflection, and without one nation following the example of another. 312. This axiom, with the saying of Dion quoted in the preceding axiom, proves that providence, being sovereign over the affairs of men, is the ordainer of the natural law of nations. 313. This same axiom establishes the difference between the natural law of the Hebrews, the natural law of nations, and the natural law of the philosophers. For whereas the Gentile nations had only the ordinary help of providence, the Hebrews had extraordinary help from the true God. On this account, the latter divided the whole world of nations into Hebrews and Gentiles. The philosophers reasoned it out more completely than the Gentiles are wont to, for they did not appear until some 2,000 years after the Gentile nations were founded. On account of their failure to observe these differences between the three natural laws, the three systems of Grotius, Selden, and Pufendorf must fall. 106. 314. Doctrines must take their beginning from that of the matters of which they treat. 315. This axiom, placed here for its application to the particular matter of the natural law of nations, is universally used in all the matters which are herein discussed. It might have been laid down among the general axioms, but it has been placed here because, in this more than any other particular matter, its truth and importance of using it are apparent. 107. 316. The first, gentes, began before the cities. They were called by the Latins gentes majores, or of ancient noble houses like those of the Roman fathers, of whom Romulus constituted the Senate, and with the Senate the city of Rome. On the other hand, they called gentes minoris the new noble houses founded after the cities. Those, for example, with whose fathers Junius Brutus, after the expulsion of the kings, replenished the Senate when it had been depleted by deaths of the senators, executed by order of Tarquinius Superbus. 108. 317. There was a corresponding twofold division of the gods. First, there were those of the gentes maiores, that is, gods who were consecrated by the families before the time of the cities. Among the Greeks and Latins, these were certainly 12 in number. We shall show that such was also the case among the first Assyrians, Chaldeans, Phoenicians, and Egyptians. Among the Greeks, their number was so well known that they were called simply the 12. These gods are brought confusedly together in a Latin distich quoted in our Principles of the Universal Law. Here, however, in Book 2, following a natural theogony or generation of the gods framed naturally in the minds of Greeks, they will be set forth in this order: Jove, Juno; Diana, Apollo; Vulcan, Saturn; Vesta; Mars, Venus; Minerva, Mercury; Neptune. Secondly, there were the gods of the gentes minoris, that is to say, those consecrated later by the peoples, for example, Romulus, whom after his death the Roman people called the god Quirinus. 318. By these three axioms, the three systems of Grotius, Selden, and Pufendorf are found wanting in their beginnings, for they begin with nations reciprocally related in the society of the entire human race, whereas among all the first nations, as we shall show here, the race began in the time of the families, under the gods of the so-called gentes maiores. 109. 319. Men of limited ideas take for law what the words expressly say. 110. 320. Golden is the definition which Ulpian assigns to civil equity: a kind of probable judgment not naturally known to all men, as natural equity is, but to those few who, being eminently endowed with prudence, experience, or learning, have come to know what things are necessary for the conservation of human society. This is what is nowadays called reason of state. 111. 321. The certitude of the laws is an obscurity of judgment, backed only by authority, so that we find them harsh in application, yet are obliged to apply them by their certitude. In good Latin, certum means particularized, or as the school says, individuated, so that in over-elegant Latin, certum and communa are opposed to each other. 322. This axiom and the two following definitions constitute the principle of strict law. Its rule is civil equity, by whose certitude, that is to say, by the determinate particularity of those words, the barbarians, men of particular, not universal ideas, are naturally satisfied, and such is the law they think is their due. So that what Ulpian says in such cases, "the law is harsh, but so it is written," may be put in the finer Latin with greater legal elegance: "the law is harsh, but it is certain." 112. 323. Intelligent men take for law whatever impartial utility dictates in each case. 113. 324. The truth of the laws is a certain light and splendor with which natural reason illuminates them, so that jurisconsults are often in the habit of saying, "It is true," for "it is fair." 325. This definition and the 111th are particular propositions whose purpose is to apply to the particular matter of the natural law of nations the two general definitions, which treat of the true and the certain in general with a view to conclusions in all the matters that are herein treated. 114. 326. The natural equity of fully developed human law is a practice of wisdom in affairs of utility, since wisdom in its broad sense is nothing but the science of making such use of things as their nature dictates. 327. This axiom and the two following definitions constitute the principle of mild law. Its rule is the natural equity which is connatural with civilized nations. This is the public school from which, as we shall show, the philosophers emerged. 328. All these last 6 propositions establish the fact that the natural law of nations was ordained by Providence. In order that the nations might be preserved, and since they had to live for centuries and capable of truth and natural equity, the latter of which the philosophers later clarified, Providence permitted them to cleave to certitude and civil equity, which guards scrupulously the words of decrees and laws, and to be led by the words to observe them generally, even in cases where they proved harsh. 329. Now the fact that the 3 princes of the doctrine of the natural law of nations knew nothing of these 6 propositions caused all 3 of them to err in concert in establishing their systems. For they believed that natural equity in its perfect form had been understood by the Gentile nations from their first beginnings. They did not reflect that it took some 2,000 years for philosophers to appear in any of them, and they took no account of the particular assistance which a single people received from the true God. This is the end of Section 2 on the elements, which covers paragraphs 213 through 329. In the next video, we will proceed to Section 3, entitled Principles. Thank you for listening.